let's talk about the great British secret weapon, radar.
What it be, what it do. Kato back with the radar review. There's a lot of hype and discontent recently about the state of helicopters and their interactions with self-propelled anti-aircraft and planes, and I'd like to opine a little on the situation, and elements that could benefit gameplay and counterplay for both Helos and SPAA. As it stands, radar SPAA in-game has a limited punching distance, while air-to-ground missiles from helicopters can reach out and strike from much further away. This reduces the incentive to play in any way other than the stereotypical spawn, hover, climb, and fire, as the only real counters to this are lucky tank shells, Soviet tank ATGMs, fixed-wing aircraft, or other helicopters, leaving self-propelled anti-aircraft entirely out of the loop and simply just targets, when realistically, helicopters are somewhat a prime target for SPAA. While I'm not suggesting that radar SPAA should be able to reach helicopter spawns, helicopter air-to-ground missiles having more reasonable punching distances would go some way to potentially remedy the current issue. There's some more to talk about on that front later though. Radar systems as they currently are in-game allow the player to lock a target and track it at all times with a continuous aiming reticle, regardless of terrain and circumstance other than range, as the aiming marker will disappear when out of range of the weaponry, as it is in our arcade, and they can even lock targets through terrain. It's pertinent to note that the lock will be broken if the aircraft goes below ground level, as you see here. In most cases this isn't a likely occurrence as it is highly location dependent, nor is it totally consistent. Without teaching anyone to suck eggs, radar functions by sending out masses of radio waves and interpreting the reflections as targets or background, or interpreting reflections from background sources. In order to recognise an object at all, it has to be obviously within line of sight, so tracking through terrain objects such as buildings and trees is clearly impossible in reality. The disparity between the way radar functions in reality and in-game obviously makes the typical real-world strategy of helicopters, namely that of pop-up attacks and utilising terrain to strike from relative cover precisely to avoid radar-guided SPAA, non-feasible, as radar SPAA will know exactly where you are at all times under all circumstances if they're paying attention and abusing the mechanic. Add to this that the range and ease of use of air-to-ground missiles allow helicopters to easily choose to strike well outside the punching distance of gun-only SPAA, and we can see that the incentive isn't there to play helicopters in the way they have historically been intended to be used. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Of note here is that the typical real-world application of helicopters is such that they are forced to be close to the ground due to the ever-present threat of surface-to-air missiles, something we also currently do not have, and then forced to use terrain to avoid gun-only SPAA. In the event that these surface-to-air missiles are added with radar as it currently is, helicopters will be highly vulnerable at all times with no reasonable counterplay available. Radar self-propelled anti-aircraft systems that we have in the game are either solely targeting radars, such as the ZSU-232 Shilka and M163, or search and target combinations such as the Flak Panzer Gepard and Automatic. In targeting-only systems, the target has to be visually identified and the weapon system then pointed more or less at the target before any kind of gun calculations are made by the system, as the targeting radar scans a small area of the sky very frequently. If we want this to resemble reality, these systems should lose their aim indicator when not directly facing the target, and also lose the locked target blip when not facing the target, as the system has no way to search for targets other than to look. Combined systems also include a search radar, the bit that spins. Search radars scan a much larger chunk of airspace much less frequently than targeting radars to identify airborne objects, but are not capable of scanning rapidly enough to provide targeting data. They still require the targeting element, which is why they're combined systems. These vehicles should have some kind of marker on all airborne vehicles within their range, but also lose the aim indicator when not facing the target, as they still require the targeting part of the system to create the gun solution calculation. At present, the radar SPAA aiming system in RB and Sim is functionally just the way aiming works with SPAA in arcade, so I can't see this being particularly easy to code and work around. It seems like a lot of work, but I won't claim to know enough about the engine or coding to make that judgment. It's worth noting that aircraft in arcade and aerialistic battles have an element of radar in terms of the directional indicator that shows enemies and friendlies. If it were possible to implement with these combined radar SPAA systems, it would provide a rather elegant analogue to how they function. In terms of their main stumbling block, helicopters, there's currently a significant amount of people arguing for so-called realistic ranges of helicopter ATGM systems, and while I recognise that being hit when you can't hit back is irritating, Positioning and logic can go a long way. A helicopter almost universally has to have line of sight to a target to engage it. Also, there is no heli-bound ATGM in-game with a maximum range less than 3,500 meters, although sources vary and don't always differentiate between maximum range and typical or effective ranges. For the purposes of this discussion, I've scrambled around and found the most typically quoted ranges for given missiles, although I can't speak for the accuracy or percentage of hits at these ranges, nor can I tell you if these are the ranges helicopter crews are even trained to fire at, or rather the technical maximum ranges of the missile engines. Often, they are simply quoted as range. The shortest range is the 9M17M missile on the Mi-4, as well as the Heinz A&D, at 3,500 meters. After this, we have the TOW, ITOW, and TOW-2, clocking in at 3,750 meters, then all hot systems at 4,000, then the 9M114 of the latter two Heinz and the Mi-35 at 5 kilometers, SS-11, also known as AGM-22s on the Alouette and early Hueys, are also at 5k, 9M120s on the Mi-35 can strike at 6 kilometers, and AGM-114B Hellfires on the AH-1Z can hit up to 8 kilometers. With this in mind, asking for helicopters to have realistic ranges seems peculiar. To my mind, a better alternative in this regard, to bring helis closer to the action without artificially limiting their striking range and, with some tweaks to radar, would come in the form of helicopters having less powerful image stabilization. Try guiding missiles without using the stabilized image at all, and you'll find it to be rather difficult, requiring much more time for the helicopter to settle before it's really possible. Bringing the stability down somewhat would force helis to bring themselves closer to the fight, as a mouse movement that causes a 2 meter difference at 500 meters becomes 16 meters at 4,000 meters, which is clearly going to impact accuracy, arguably for the better. Yet another option is partially reducing the level of zoom available to helicopters. It's also important to note that these missile values are maximum ranges, not typical ranges, and they certainly don't guarantee a high hit probability. As I said, a small correction makes a massive difference at longer range, limiting their effectiveness at greater distances, and this would appear to be something that would positively influence counterplay between helicopters and ground units. As I said, I don't know if those values that we quoted a moment ago are meant to be the maximum values, or if the crews are even trained to fire at those distances, so to bring it down somewhat doesn't seem outside the realms of possibility. I won't claim to be above the way things currently are. Spawning in a helicopter armed with ATGMs allows you to net at least a few kills on ground units with relatively low risk to yourself, and can significantly influence the game. However, this situation is upsetting a number of people, and I feel the potential tweaks I have discussed would go some way towards both enriching the gameplay and addressing these perceived issues. It would also facilitate a more smooth addition of surface-to-air missiles further down the line. In my view, reducing the stability or zoom level of helicopter optics and also stopping radar from tracking aircraft through terrain, trees, or any obstruction is the easiest way to address the current meta of top tier without distracting in any significant manner from the gameplay or balance of the vehicles. Thank you for your time, I hope you've liked the video, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about the subject. See you on Twitch.